What's up, guys? Jay Martin here, investor and CEO of Cambridge House. And my guest today is Peter Schiff, the CEO and Chief Global Strategist at EuroPacific Capital, in addition to the host of the Peter Schiff Show. And today we talked about the education system, we talked about inflation, we talked about international residential real estate, and a host of other topics. Always a fun conversation with Peter. So I hope you enjoy this one. Three things before we begin this. Peter will be at my show, my conference, in January in Vancouver, Canada. I'd love you to be there. He's one of about 80 keynote speakers. We're flying in from all over the world. Beneath this video, there's a pinned comment where you can hit up the event site, buy tickets. I'd love to have you there. Number two, this YouTube channel now generates a decent amount of revenue. And so what I've decided to do with that cash is donate it to an organization that's super close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Zero Ceiling's mission is to end youth homelessness, and they do an excellent job. Number three, if you prefer to listen to my content as opposed to watch it, you can now find me wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for The Jay Martin Show. All right, here's Peter Schiff. Enjoy. I assemble the smartest people I can think of or reach out to carry that conversation, and that's exactly what I've done today.
Please give my panel a round of applause. Welcome.
Peter, it's good to see you again. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Oh, it's always my pleasure to participate in your show.
All right. You know, here's an interesting place we could start. I was reading these headlines this morning. The United States right now is on a 6-month streak of setting records for Americans who have quit their job voluntarily. Every month for 6 months, if I got this right, it was like 4.3 million in August, 4.4 million in September. Looks like set to surpass that again in October. And as I interpret this is voluntarily Americans who are voluntarily leaving the workforce, increasing in number month over month for the last 6 months straight. What do you make of this?
Well, you know, there can be a lot of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, some people, maybe they're working in the underground economy. So maybe they're officially not working, but, you know, unofficially they are if they're still out there, you know, getting paid under the table or something. Obviously, too, there are a lot of people that would rather just collect government benefits. I think a lot of the supplemental additional benefits are not available anymore, but there's certainly enough benefits there that I think some people just weigh the relative cost benefit and decide they'd rather not work. It's unfortunate that the government gives them that choice, right? They shouldn't be able to choose not to work. If they're able-bodied and can work, they should be working. But also, I think that a lot of people just are at home trading all day. You know, they're day trading stocks on the Robinhood app, or maybe they're trading cryptocurrencies, and they just don't think they need to work anymore. They found an easier way to get rich, or, you know, to make money. And in fact, maybe a lot of people have so much money now on paper that they don't think they need to actually earn any money working a 9-to-5 job anymore. So that, you know, there's a lot of things going on, but it certainly is a problem that is, you know, adding to the many problems that already exist in the economy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about the day traders. You know, I was looking at this like we've just come out of, you know, a pretty surreal experience, or we're coming out of this surreal experience being the global pandemic. And during that time, a lot of people were forced to stay home, maybe think a bit differently about how they're allocating their time. And they've come out the other end of this deciding that they no longer agree that renting their time for the going rate, whatever's being offered, is worth it anymore. And so, you know, does that ring true with you? Do you think there's a psychological shift in how people are valuing their time and their contribution?
Well, it depends on the alternative, because people still need to eat. You know, it's not like just because food is more expensive, it doesn't mean you don't need a job anymore. Even if your wages don't quite go as far as they used to. So I think that there's more at play here. I do think that, especially with younger people, there's a lot of younger people in crypto, and a lot of these people think they're rich, and maybe that's why they quit their job. But you know, they just don't realize that they're not rich, because they're just looking at their wallets, their crypto wallets, and who knows what coins they've got in there. But you know, you're talking about almost a $3 trillion market cap now, or maybe a little bit more. I forget, for all these cryptos combined. So on paper, there's a lot of people that have a lot of wealth, Whether they ultimately realize that wealth is a different story, but the psychological impact of it is real.
Yeah, okay, 100%. So here's a question that I was asked on a podcast recently. I'd love to ask it to you and get your thoughts. They asked me if I could change one thing about the education system, what would that be? So if you, Peter, could change one thing about the education system, thinking about the next generation of professionals coming up from as young as elementary through to high school and college, what strikes you as something that needs to change?
Well, the simplest thing would be to get the government out of it.
Okay.
I just don't think government should have a role in education at all. I think we would get much better education from the private sector than we get from the government. Anything the government does, it's not going to do well, right? Whatever they make is going to be really expensive, and the quality is going to be very poor. But whatever the private sector makes, the costs are going to be low, and the quality is going to be high. And that doesn't change when you apply it to education. A competitive free market in education would mean higher quality and lower cost. And, private businesses can compete for education money. There's nothing that says they can't do that. And the idea that, we're getting it for free because we're getting it from the government, it's not free at all. It's extremely expensive. If you look at how much the government pays per pupil, it's astronomical. And so the society, we would all save a lot of money collectively if we paid for education instead of getting it for free from the government. It would be a lot less expensive.
Now, why do you think that anything related to finance or the language of money is overlooked in current curriculums? We can go through 2 decades of education and not spend a day talking about tax strategies or credits and interest rates, let alone things like compounding capital gains and leverage. And as a consequence, people wake up usually in their mid-30s trying to figure this stuff out for the first time because they've been...
Yeah, obviously some of these concepts could be introduced, in an econ class or the equivalent of a home economics. If they even teach home ec anymore, I'm not really sure if that's politically correct to have home economics, but that's where that type of stuff would come in, budgeting and things like that. But, you don't need school to learn those type of concepts. You could read about them online, and your parents, should be imparting that knowledge on you. It's not something that you necessarily have to entrust to the school system to teach those, basics of life.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. And as a parent, I think I take that on. Do you think that is a leading contributing factor to why there's so much civil unrest and this rise of populism globally? The way I see it, Peter, would be that, we're all playing the same game, but a very small percentage of us know the rules. And when I say the rules, understand the ebbs and flow of capital and the language of money and financial markets and, how the world functions, in front of our eyes or behind the scenes, however you want to look at it. But as a consequence, people are waking up, looking at the Monopoly board and saying, how did I get so far behind? Somebody must have cheated, right? How did this happen to me?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of factors responsible, but certainly the educational system, bears part of that responsibility. The teachers are extremely biased in their views of capitalism. Teachers don't make a lot of money. They make okay money for what they do, especially on an hourly basis. And teachers, enjoy a lot of leisure. They have a lot of time off that most people don't get. They have, long vacations, especially over the summertime. So, they're decent jobs being a teacher. There's also a lot of personal satisfaction that you can derive out of, being a teacher versus a lot of other occupations, that are a lot more mundane. And so you don't necessarily enjoy the work as much as, most teachers should enjoy, what they're doing. But I think a lot of teachers are very envious and very resentful of the fact that they're not millionaires and billionaires. And so I think they impart that on their students. They have a very biased, very left, leaning worldview. They don't like capitalism because they think capitalism undervalues what they're doing. They all think that they should be paid more than they are. And they're envious of people who they think are less deserving, but who have a lot more money. So I think, people, when you're exposed to that constantly, when all of your teachers think a certain way, right? When they're all very socialist minded and they don't believe in free enterprise, individual liberty, or capitalism, or really any of the founding principles of this country, that's going to, have a big influence on all the kids that are going through the U.S. school system, their entire lives. And so we're graduating a bunch of socialists. But part of the problem, of course, is the phony economy that's been created here in the U.S., artificially low interest rates, quantitative easing, this whole consumer debt-financed bubble economy that we have is a reason that we haven't created more affluence among, average Americans. And we've been able to, widen the divide between the very rich and everybody else. And that, of course, breeds additional resentment.
Okay, now I gotta think that we're moving towards a solution. So you talked a lot about socialism in the school system and underpaid teachers and or at least perception of underpaid teachers. And I agree with you there. It strikes me as odd because I can see a scenario where educators are incredibly well paid and compensated well for their time. But, as a parent, the question I ask right now is like, why would I restrict, when I want to learn about a subject, right? I take to all the resources I have available to me. I'm not restricted by geography if I want to learn about something, whereas my kids are restricted by geography to the immediate educators they have around them, right?
Well, they shouldn't be, especially with the internet. I mean, geography should be not a factor at all. And especially with so many kids, with COVID, they didn't even go to school anyway, where they're just learning at home.
Right.
So why do they have to learn at home from their local school? Why can't it be in another state or another country, wherever they can get the best education? But, the problem with teachers, it's not that they're underpaid. I mean, the vast majority of teachers are overpaid. That is the problem. The bad ones are overpaid. The good ones are probably underpaid. But the way the unions have everything structured, it's all designed, for the lowest common denominator.
Right.
So, you don't get paid more if you're a better teacher. They don't want that. They don't want merit type pay. They want everybody to be paid the same. The only variable is seniority, like how long you've been a teacher, not whether or not you're any good at it, just how many years you've been paying dues to the union. Right. So the longer you've been there, and then often what happens is, when you have to let go of some teachers, you have to let go of the ones that you just hired, even if they're a lot better than the ones that have been there for longer.
Right.
You're making decisions on seniority, not quality. And seniority should not be the factor. You want the best teachers.
Yeah.
And the best teachers need to be paid more, just like in, any other occupation. Right. The better you are, the more you get paid. Why should teaching be different? Why should, no matter how bad you are, you're going to get paid as well as, the people who are, bending over backwards to go the extra mile and do a better job? Because then you even disincentivize the good teachers. Hey, why am I, breaking my back to be good? I'm not having any extra income to show for it. So, you destroy the motivation. Nobody is incentivized to do good, and no one is penalized for doing bad.
Right.
So we have, a bad, school system where, if we had a free market, it would be completely different.
Yeah. Okay. So that explains to me perfectly why, right, we shouldn't have a public school system, or why we should have more alternatives, I should say, to a public school system. And I completely advocate for that. Okay. So the reason I wanted to start with all this stuff about, the record amount of Americans that are voluntarily leaving their job, about maybe a disconnect between the way the world functions and the amount of people who can actually speak the language of money, is because you put out a video in 2010, I believe, that ended up going viral I think it was just called I Am the 1%, Let's Talk. And you went down to a bunch of Occupy Wall Street movements and started having conversations, right? With everybody there. It was like, let's talk about what's going on here. Let me answer some questions for you, right? If you haven't seen this video, by the way, you should watch it because it's great. But this is 11 years ago at this point, Peter. So you went right to the heart of the protest movements during the Occupy Wall Street with a sign that said, I am the 1%, because they were protesting the 1% at that time, and said, let's talk, and then had a ton of conversations. What's changed from then to now, Peter, when you look at those similar protests and how they've evolved?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't know that I can even do something like that today, because at least in that conversation, I didn't really feel threatened at all, physically by the mob that was, around me. Whereas today, I think the whole thing would be a lot more charged. I mean, there could be a lot of violence, and they could try to make something racial out of it, because I happen to be a white man. I mean, it wasn't that big a sin back then being a white man. But today, I'm the personification of evil, right? I'm systemically racist. So, it may have been a difficult conversation to have today, in similar circumstances. But one thing that has, I think, happened is that the animosity that a lot of people feel towards capitalism has probably grown over the decade. A lot more people now probably hold capitalism in very low regard and have a very high opinion of socialism. And, my point of going down there was to point out that the problems that everybody was protesting emanated from government and central banking, not capitalism. And that it wasn't capitalism that needed to be protested. It was the government interference in capitalism. And that they needed to focus their protests in Washington and not in New York. And to the extent that the banks had gotten in bed with the government, the problem isn't the banks, it's the government. Obviously the government is, enticing these companies to get into bed with them. And so what you want to do is make it so the government can't do that. The government doesn't have this to offer, because you can't blame private actors for taking advantage of what the government offers. And in fact, in many cases, you're pressured, because if you don't take advantage of it, your competitors will, and then you'll be at a disadvantage. So what we have to do is stop the government from being able to offer this kind of help and these kind of distortions and subsidies. So, for example, the Occupy Wall Street people were mad about the Wall Street bailouts. Well, yes, so was I. But it wasn't that the companies accepted the bailouts. It was that the governments offered the bailouts in the first place.
Right.
So it's the government where our anger needs to be focused. Because a lot of the companies were like, well, if I don't take the bailout money and my competitors do, well, I mean, I'm standing on principle. For what reason? I'm going to be at a disadvantage. And so, hey, if everybody's going to get it, well, then I'm going to get mine. And so it's the government that is corrupting the whole process, not the private actors.
Right, which kind of gets us back to, the importance of teaching the language of money at an early stage. Because if you wake up in your 30s and, like I said, you look at the board and you're like, what happened here? How did I end up so behind? You feel disenfranchised. The next step is to point the finger and look for the enemy, right?
It's like during the COVID lockdowns, I was, pointing out that a lot of people were just taking the government money and not going back to work because, the government money was more lucrative. I mean, even if you had a job, why go back to it if you're actually getting paid more not to work than you were working? I mean, why take a pay cut to go get a job? I mean, you're supposed to earn more by having a job, not earn less. I mean, most Americans or anybody, there's a value placed on leisure. People prefer leisure to work. And in fact, even if the government gives me 80% of my income on unemployment, most people would take that rather than 100% on a job. And so I talked about this, and a lot of people were saying, oh, Peter, you're just accusing all these Americans of being lazy. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm just recognizing that they're not foolish and they're just making the best choice for themselves given the various alternatives. I never blamed Americans for taking government checks and not going to work, right? That's a rational decision.
Yeah.
Especially if you're going to be one of the few Americans that says, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to turn down all this money and I'm going to go back to my lousy job, right? Meanwhile, all your buddies are hanging out on the beach, and you're the one fool that returned to work, right? And they've got more money than you because they're getting bigger unemployment checks than your paycheck. It's very difficult to get on that moral high ground when, you look like such an idiot, right, for occupying that space. So I don't blame people for doing this. I mean, I remember one time when I was on unemployment a long time ago, the one time of my life I collected unemployment, I made sure that I exhausted every dime of my benefits before I actually looked for a job. I mean, I was taking advantage of my paid vacation. But from an economic perspective, I'm completely against unemployment for the precise reason that people exploit it. And I'm an example of somebody who exploited a program that philosophically I was opposed to. And if I could have voted to eliminate unemployment for everybody, including myself, I would have. But once the government made it available, well, I was going to take my share, even though I didn't believe anybody should have, that opportunity. So while I was talking about all these Americans that were just taking government checks instead of going back to work, I never blamed the people. I blamed the government. It was a stupid, misguided program that actually started under Trump, right? Trump signed that idiotic bill that gave people such a huge pay increase to leave their work, leave their jobs, right? It was the government that was dumb enough to give people this choice in the first place. It wasn't the people that did the smart thing, because that's human nature. But government will never understand human nature, and they don't understand moral hazard because their policies, their subsidies, and their taxes are largely responsible for a lot of the bad things that happen.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you. It's not lazy. It's logical. If somebody offers you 80% of your income to quit your job and do nothing, you can retire today and retain 80% of your income. That's a great trade-off. You get 100% of your time and 80% of your income.
But during COVID, there were people that were making 2 or 3 times by staying home.
Right.
Because they supplemented your unemployment with an extra $600 a week. And if your regular unemployment was like $200 a week, you were getting $800. But what if you only earned $400 a week when you had your job? Why would you go back to a $400 job that you hate when you can get $800 a week, just to have fun? So, and that's one of the reasons that spending went up, because unemployed people were earning more unemployed than when they had jobs. And they didn't have to waste money commuting back and forth, or there's a lot of costs that you incur to have a job other than giving up all your free time. But when you're just staying at home, you have all kinds of extra money to spend.
Okay, so I'm not American. I'm not in the US, so I'm not as up to speed on those programs and how they operate today. But how much of a contributing factor is that to these record numbers of people voluntarily leaving their job? And if it's
I think those extended benefits have now expired. So I think people are just back to regular benefits. So I don't think they're doing as much damage as they did, which is why, people are returning to work, right? Because that gravy train is over. But I think the benefits that people qualify for now are better than what they were pre-COVID. You take away those, exceptional benefits. So that is another incentive for people not to work, because the government does make it more lucrative today not to work with the various programs that you qualify for, provided that you don't have a job, right? Because the government creates that moral hazard, because the minute you start earning money, you start losing the benefits. So it's like a tax on work, because not only do you pay income taxes or payroll taxes when you get a job, but you also forfeit all these benefits that you get when you don't have a job. So the government, it makes the decision to get a job kind of expensive because you have to you give up a bunch of freebies the minute you start earning money for yourself.
Okay. All right. So let's switch gears a little bit. Inflation numbers came out last week. They got a lot more people fired up. I think the number was higher than a lot of, well, probably not you, but a lot of other people anticipated, right? You've been on Twitter calling for essentially a repeat of that 70s show. It was about to hit our life. So, what did those numbers tell you, Peter? And how are you responding right now?
Well, they don't tell me anything I don't already know. I mean, we got a big jump in the CPI. It was 0.9%. I think they were looking for 0.6, which is a big number in and of itself, except the actual number was 50% greater than that. I think if you annualize the first 10 months of 2021, you're almost at 7% CPI. But even that really doesn't tell the whole story because the CPI itself understates what's going on with prices. Just rents are an obvious and glaring example where rents are up maybe 12% on the year, yet owner's equivalent rent is up 3% or something like that. But you can't actually pay owner's equivalent rent. You actually have to pay the real rent. But that's a third of the CPI, and it's a completely made up number, and it's much lower than actual rents. And of course, if you look at home prices, they're up like 20%. On the year. So that's even worse. I mean, if you're buying a house, you're looking at even bigger price increases than if you're just renting. But all the costs associated with home ownership or home rental have gone up. Your electric bill has gone up, right? All the various maintenance, your insurance, taxes, everything is going up. And I think in general faster than the 7% that is being reflected in the CPI. So I think if we still had the CPI that we had during the 1970s, if we were measuring the prices today using the same CPI that they used to measure them back in the 1970s, we would be well into the double digits right now. Okay. In fact, 2021 could be as bad, if not worse, than any individual year of that decade.
Okay, guys, 3 last things. First, if you enjoy my interviews and would like a bit more, you can subscribe to my Friday newsletter. It's free, and the comment to subscribe is right beneath this video in that pinned comment. In this newsletter, I share my key lessons learned, takeaways, and any actions that I might be taking in the market as a consequence of what I've learned on the show. Second, when I started a YouTube channel, I never anticipated generating any advertising revenue. But coincidentally, I do now, which is awesome. And so what I've decided to do is donate this to an organization that is very close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Their mission is to end youth homelessness. The way they do this is by providing young people experiencing homelessness with supportive housing, employment, professional support, life skills, and outdoor adventure. Because often young people in urban centers with no resources will never get the opportunity to experience wild places, nature that can be so transformational, and absolutely was for me. Third, if you prefer to listen to my content, you can now find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for The Jay Martin Show.